So today I am going to introduce you to Dr. Lauren Hack, who is currently assistant professor and attending psychology here within UCSF Psychiatry. And she's going to be, she completed her graduate training at Marquis University in Milwaukee with a particular focus on ADHD, conceptualization and assessment for Latinx youth of Spanish-speaking families. She joined us here at UCSF as a trainee through the Clinical Psychology Training Program, the CPTP, and during her intern year and subsequent postdoctoral fellowship, she extended her multicultural ADHD focus to psychosocial treatment under the mentorship of Dr. Linda Pfeiffer. She collaborates with the UCSF researchers on the Juvenile Justice Behavioral Health Research Team and Fuerte, and the Fuerte project here at San Francisco General, and provides clinical services and supervision within the mood, anxiety, and hyperactivity, attention, and learning problems clinics at Langley Porter. Dr. Hack is also passionate about community engagement and frequently provides consultation, training, and in-service continuing education to school mental health professionals, social workers, and other community providers in the United States and in Mexico. Okay, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really happy to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well to talk to you about the ADHD help-seeking behavior model as a framework for reducing disparities in Latinx youth worldwide. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging my funding support and say that I don't have any conflict of interest to report. By the end of this, I would hope that we would all be able to apply this ADHD help-seeking behavior model to understand health disparities for Latinx youth. Also, hopefully you'll be able to connect culturally attuned outreach and assessment strategies to barriers for help-seeking in Latinx families, and also understand a theory-driven and replicable method for adapting evidence-based services for underserved groups. I'll start with an introduction about ADHD health disparities and the help-seeking behavior model, and then I'll talk about two studies, one in the United States and one in Mexico, that investigate all of the help-seeking behavior model stages, which we'll outline, and then end with recommendations and future directions. But before I get into that, I wanted to address a question that I'm often asked, which is how a white girl from Hartland, Wisconsin became interested in this work. And so really it started with my father encouraging me to learn Spanish when I was in middle school. He said if I did that, I would always have a job, and it was actually probably the most true and helpful advice anyone's ever given me. And then in college, I did a study abroad in Spain and worked with Spanish-speaking youth in the schools. And so for graduate training, I really wanted to find an opportunity that would be able to let me keep using my Spanish working with youth. And so I landed at Marquette University in Milwaukee, which has an evidence-based behavioral ADHD treatment center. And they were specifically looking for a Spanish-speaking graduate student because they were getting a lot of referrals for Spanish-speaking only families and had the materials but didn't have a clinician who was able to do that. So I went to Marquette for that opportunity and really just delved into this work. My first case as a graduate student was a parent training case of a Spanish-speaking only parent. And so they're coming into the ADHD clinic, I give them the assessment, and the child does not meet criteria for ADHD because the parent's not reporting any ADHD symptoms. So I was like, what the heck? Like, we're the ADHD clinic. Why on earth would a family come to the ADHD clinic if their child doesn't have ADHD? And so I sat down with the parent and I said, you know, I'm just confused about the teacher is saying that she's seeing these things in the classroom and you're saying you're not seeing them. And the parent says, well, I see it, but the question asked if it was a problem. And to me, these things aren't a problem, right? My child's really spirited, but I don't think it's a problem, so that's why I didn't mark those questions. And so this is where my understanding of the mismatch between the way we ask about symptoms and the way we describe services really has an impact on families engaging in those services. And so that really inspired my career-long work looking at how we can make ADHD conceptualization and care more universal so that all families in need are engaging in services. And then I came to UCSF for my CPTB internship and fellowship to continue looking at this idea of ADHD, but really focused on the treatment. And so today I'll kind of go through what we've gathered from this work so far. So as I was starting in the ADHD clinic and having this understanding that it seems like there's some mismatch between families needing services and families coming in and identifying ADHD, this question was being asked around the world. So this is a meta-analysis by Ferrone and his colleagues. The worldwide prevalence of ADHD, is it an American condition? About the same time, this not as scientific but very impactful blog post came out. You might remember from 2012, Why French Kids Don't Have ADHD, caught a lot of attention in the media. And then our own Dr. Stephen Hinshaw dedicates an entire chapter in his 2014 book, The ADHD Explosion, to understanding this question of differences in identification and service use across cultural groups. If we look to that 2003 meta-analysis, interestingly, what we find is the worldwide prevalence rate of ADHD hangs right around 5 to 10% if you ask about ADHD in a culturally sensitive way. And this has been replicated again and again in meta-analyses and epidemiological studies since 2003. And really this confirms the statement that Dr. Hinshaw makes in his book, which is that ADHD is an equal opportunity condition. So if it is an equal opportunity condition, if everybody, regardless of their background, has an equal chance of getting this, why are there such differences in identification and treatment? We do know that although Latinx youth are at the same rate of developing ADHD, they are much less likely to be diagnosed and receive care for ADHD than their Caucasian peers. So this is data from the 2002 epidemiological study of the National Survey of American Families, showing that 88% of Latinx youth versus 76% of white youth are estimated to have need that did not receive care. And Latinx children with mental health problems in the study had greater odds of having no care or having unmet need than white children. And this is even after adjusting for demographic factors like socioeconomic status. So there really seems to be some disparity that's based in cultural differences, not just socio-demographic differences, that are contributing to these health disparities in ADHD diagnosis and care. This is a really important question for us here at UCSF because we know that Latinx youth population is rapidly growing. So the more Latinx youth we have in our area, the more unmet need we're going to have if we don't address these healthcare disparities. So now that I've told you that we have really well-documented healthcare disparities for ADHD, let's start to think about why we're seeing those disparities. And to start us off with this, I'd actually like us all to do an activity. So I am going to show a couple of 1-minute silent videos of a Latinx boy exhibiting ADHD-like behaviors. And I'd like you all to either pull out a slip of paper or your notes on your phone, or if you're really good at mental records, just keep track of what you see. If you were a parent and this was your kid, what would you notice? What would you call it? What would you describe it as? What would you think is causing it? And what would you think would be helpful to improve it? Okay? So first we're going to look at a video in the home setting. Unless it's frozen, which it looks like it is. Okay, so Jose's mom has given instructions to clean up the living room, and his brother is on the phone. They're expecting company in 15 minutes. There's no volume, it's silent. Take a minute to jot down or mentally note, what did you see in that video? What would you call it? What do you think causes it? What would you think would help it? Next, we're going to look at a video in the school setting, and yes, this is a much younger version of me acting as the teacher. After instructions to the class, Jose and his classmates are supposed to do a short assignment individually and turn it in. Meanwhile, there's another class right outside the window at recess. So again, think about what you saw, how you might describe that, what words you might use, what you might think causes it, and then think about if that matches or doesn't match what you might find on an ADHD symptom screener and how you might find ADHD treatment described. And so this activity hopefully got you thinking about some factors that can be conceptualized along the help-seeking behavior model, which was developed for ethnic minority families by Adhd and colleagues in 2006. And it outlines 4 stages, but I kind of combine the second 2 stages since I do more school-based work, so they kind of go together. But let me walk you through each stage and what these different factors can look like in terms of ADHD help-seeking. So in order for help to start for ADHD, someone must recognize ADHD-like problems in the child. And this is oftentimes a parent or a teacher. And what can get in the way of parents and teachers noticing those behaviors are lack of knowledge about or experience with ADHD services. Also, if we're assessing those problems on a symptom rating scale, we want to think about what's the reading level, is it matching the reading level of the person filling it out? And then culturally, there's also differences in beliefs about what causes behaviors and also expectations about what we decide is acceptable or unacceptable for our children, right? So when you were watching that video and seeing those behaviors of a Jose, think about what you might think causes those behaviors, and that might be actually quite different than what some of our families think causes those behaviors. You might have been very bothered by some of those behaviors if you were a parent. Other parents might not be bothered by that. And they might say that that's actually okay. That's just developmentally kind of a boy being a boy, right? And traditional Latinx values like familismo and respeto can really play a role into what families think is acceptable and unacceptable. So these quotes are from a Caldasa 2010 study that I think really nicely exemplify these values. So here's a quote exemplifying familismo. You have to help each other out, be there for each other, especially when you're growing up or when you have families. I mean that togetherness is very important. So someone who is holding really strong to this value may be more accepting of their child's a lot of activity, kind of some of these behaviors. They might be more accepting of that because of this family togetherness. On the flip side, though, respect and obedience to authority is very highly valued in traditional Latinx values. So, for example, this quote of, if he doesn't obey or did something wrong, that's a lack of respect, right? So when I grew up in my white middle-class household, if you didn't follow an instruction, that wasn't conceptualized as disrespect, and yet in Latinx cultures, many times it is. So the way we think about behaviors in context of our culture can very much impact how we're going to evaluate if those behaviors are okay or if there's something that needs help. So if a parent is able to overcome barriers and identify problematic behaviors in their child, then they must decide if they're going to seek help and which type of help they're going to seek. And there are a lot of practical barriers in our country for help seeking, which we're all aware of here in this building, right? So we know that being impoverished and having a lack of insurance coverage definitely prevents you from getting good care. Also, lack of English proficiency, even when you have a translator, it's definitely a barrier. And obviously, immigration or documentation status can be very much preventative in terms of families feeling comfortable seeking care, especially from large organizations. And then in addition to practical barriers, we also have cultural barriers, which may prevent a family from seeking help. So there's a pretty dark history in our country of minorities being mistreated and misunderstood by that mental health care profession, so there's a lot of stigma and distrust. Also, many Latinx families explain or describe the sense that if their families knew that they were seeking mental health treatment, that would not be very supported in their community, because mental health is seen as a very stigmatized disorder. You're loco, you're crazy. It's not something that everybody bends around and says, yes, we're supporting you in this. Again, these are generalizations, not a one-to-one rule, but these are kind of trends that come out of the qualitative research and quantitative research that we see. Also, many of these families may have experienced discriminatory behavior from providers in the past, which obviously would create a barrier for seeking help again in the future. If a parent, though, is overcome all of those barriers and engages in services, then we look at how are they actually utilizing the services, what's the quality of the services, how much adherence are the families showing to the services, and what are the outcomes. And so, of course, if a family isn't able to afford participating in the service, that's going to prevent them from attending and engaging. And even if a service is free, if you think about all of the costs to attending a session, like having to provide childcare, maybe having to miss work, having to secure transportation, there's a lot of costs actually, even if the service itself doesn't cost anything, but oftentimes it does. And then culturally, if the provider and the family don't feel like they understand each other, they can feel lack of rapport. And if the programs, if the treatments that we're doing aren't relevant to what the families are wanting, they're obviously not going to attend and engage in them and be able to show good outcomes. So now that we've overviewed ADHD health disparities and the conceptual model for help seeking, I'd like to dig into two studies that I've been working on over the past 5 or 6 years. The first one's in San Francisco, and the second one is in Culiacan, Sinaloa, Mexico. And these are both in context of randomized controlled trials of an evidence-based treatment for ADHD, which is delivered in the schools, and it's called the Collaborative Life Skills, or CLS program. So the CLS program is developed right here at UC San Francisco by Linda Pfeiffer. It is comprised of 3 evidence-based behavioral treatments for ADHD. The first is parent skills groups, so parent management training, teaching things like effective praise, effective instructions, consistent discipline. Classroom management, this is done in the form of a daily report card. So teachers select individual behavior goals for the child and then give frequent feedback throughout the day on those goals, and then the child exchanges points on his daily report card for a reward or a privilege at home. And then also the children come to group to learn about things like social skills and organization skills and emotional regulation. And what the trial in the United States with English-speaking families found is that school social workers can indeed deliver this treatment with fidelity, and children who are receiving the treatment show improvements in ADHD and ODD symptoms, as well as impairment compared to children waiting to receive the program. When the school district and Dr. Pfeiffer were collaborating on this RCT, the school district said, if you're going to come into our schools and do this, okay, but we want a Spanish version too, because we've got a lot of Spanish-speaking only families and we really don't have good services for them. And so that's where I came in. Again, my father's advice. This is how I got my fellowship. She needed someone to do this grant, and that's essentially how I got here at UCSF. And as you may imagine, sorry, there's some messages up here that are sticking. There are some inherent aspects of CLS that could theoretically combat these barriers that we've identified along the help-seeking behavior model. So, in response to the practical barriers of money and insurance coverage, CLS is delivered for free, no cost at all to families, right there in the schools. So oftentimes the parents will come drop their kids off and then the group's held right there. So pretty easy, convenient, no cost. We also offer childcare when needed for if there's like younger siblings or the parent needs to attend the group. We make sure that we have a bilingual, bicultural, and culturally sensitive staff. And what's really, I think, unique about CLS compared to other ADHD treatments is that it's designed as a program. Children do not need an ADHD diagnosis to attend. They only need to be identified as having difficulty with inattention and hyperactivity or impulsivity by parents or teachers. And it's really designed as a skills-based learning program. So it's not, we don't use the word treatment, we don't use the word ADHD, so a lot of that stigma attached to mental health care is eliminated. All right, so let's take a look at what our studies in San Francisco and Mexico showed us about barriers and potential solutions along the help-seeking behavior model. So our first question regarding problem recognition that we looked at our families in San Francisco was, will Latinx parents in the CLS study recognize ADHD differently than the non-Latinx parents? And so this is just a bird's eye view of the families who did participate in that original CLS trial. We had 159 youth, 56 were Latinx, across 23 San Francisco Unified Schools. And as I said, we had 4 of those cohorts pre-designated to receive the program in Spanish. The school social workers documented how many families they approached and how many said yes. The parents or caregivers and teachers rated the children's ADHD symptoms and impairment at baseline and at post, regardless of if the children were in the active treatment or the waitlist control. And then our clinical staff were present at all of the sessions, and we rated how faithful those social workers were to the manual and materials and how engaged the families were and the children were. We also did a qualitative study as part of my postdoc. And so our clinical staff, as I said, observed those families participating in CLS. We also invite Latinx caregivers to respond to an open-ended questionnaire and participate in a focus group or interview. And from those responses, we developed a ADHD help-seeking behavior code book. And we coded those interview and focus group responses using a program called Transana. And then we uncovered emerging themes. All right, so here are our first section of results related to problem recognition. And so what we did find were that Latinx caregivers were more likely to underestimate ADHD symptoms compared to teachers. And this matches exactly what I told you was happening in Milwaukee, where the teachers were telling these families, go get these ADHD services from the ADHD clinic, but the parent was like, well, I'll go, but I don't really care about if he's fidgeting or if he's running around the table and driven by a motor, right? So the way that we see this, when you're looking at discrepancies between reporters, you can't just take a difference score because that statistically kind of doesn't account for all the variance. So what we do is we plot these polynomial regressions, and as you can see, the green line here represents a significant interaction slope showing that if you are Latinx, it's more probable that your teacher is reporting high levels of ADHD and the parent is reporting low levels of ADHD. Although I'm telling you that that's the best statistical way to do that, I know that that's really hard to actually wrap your head around. So a more digestible way to look at this data, but not as quite as sophisticated, is showing that in our Latinx group, we had more youth who the teacher rated them as higher, and in our non-Latinx group, actually more youth had the parents rating them as more severe. So that's why we see that interaction. If we look at impairment, interestingly, we find that regardless of what teachers say, Latino caregivers were more likely to report higher levels of child impairment. And this again matches what I anecdotally found in Milwaukee. So when I sat down with those families who didn't endorse symptoms on the symptom rating scale, if I asked them, well, why are you coming in then? They'd say, well, my kid's not doing well in school, he's getting picked on, he has no friends, like we can't get anything done at home. And that's all impairment, right? That's the impairment that goes along with ADHD. And what we're finding here in our study is being found around the country as well. And really the trend is showing that symptomatology is a more culturally biased construct, whereas impairment is a little bit more universal. And I think this makes a lot of just common sense, right? If we think about how much we're all gonna say a child is driven by a motor, like what on earth does that mean? That's not descriptive at all, right? If we say though, how is the child doing in school? Well, we can look at their report card and say pretty well they're at grade level or they're not, right? It's much more universal. There's less of that cultural connotation that could have us thinking about the question differently. When we looked at our focus group and interview data, we found that Latinx caregivers recognized a range of problems. But again, kind of matching with our quantitative data, more caregivers were kind of off the bat describing impairment, and really few people were describing hyperactive impulsive symptoms, and only one person said the word ADHD or ADD, even though all of their kids technically met criteria. So really interesting symptoms, the diagnosis, that terminology really doesn't matter that much, it's really showing this impairment. So here's some example quotes that have been translated. He laughs about anything and everything, is distracting his classmates. Here's one capture of symptoms. So there's a word that doesn't quite translate well in Spanish, inquieto, and it's kind of like restless, kind of hyperactive. But we heard that much less frequently than we heard things like he's not doing well in class. The one quote we had about the diagnosis was the parent said, I feel like it could be ADD more than ADHD. When we asked the parents what do they think causes ADHD, interestingly, a lot of people did say biopsychosocial causes, but the most common cause was something about the child's personality. So this mom said it's part of her personality, she likes to talk a lot, right? And so that's very different than saying there's something about this child's brain structure that's developing differently. All right, so what did we learn from that problem recognition study in San Francisco that we tried to translate into solutions for our subsequent study in Mexico? So when we went down to Culiacan, Sinaloa, Mexico to bring the CLS program to that setting, because my colleague Ava, who helped with the study in San Francisco, who was down in Sinaloa, said our community really wants this program, we don't have anything like it. So we applied for funding to adapt the program and bring it down there. We wanted to see if we could use a novel method, thinking outside the box, rather than these symptom rating scales, which we know are biased. Could we use something else that would get families identifying these ADHD problems that they need help for in a more culturally attuned way? And so we went back to that video that I showed you at the beginning of the little Latinx boy exhibiting behaviors, and we showed that to all families and school personnel in any school that we were doing the CLS program in. And this was a way to just, across the board to the community, show this is what we are trying to do. Our program is designed to fix this, but you call it what you want to, we're not going to use our words. Okay, so we wanted to see if we did that, if we used outreach using this video, can we overcome some of these problem recognition barriers? So again, any school that we were doing our program in, we invited all of the families and school personnel to a meet and greet. And after an introductory greeting, we showed that the entire ADHD behavioral impairment video. And we did that both to get some needs assessment data, but then we also said anybody who feels like this kid is their kid in the video, anybody who feels like they would like help for something like this video, that's our program, come talk to us. And we got a lot of referrals from families saying, that's my kid, that I don't know if we would have gotten if we would have just described it using words and not using that video. When we asked the families, we had 313 who thus far completed that needs assessment. When we said, what would you call what's happening to Jose in the video? Most people actually did say ADHD and ADD when given the option. And many also did endorse biopsychosocial causes. A little bit different than our results in San Francisco. We found that in Mexico, the most common cause identified was the family. So like a lack of discipline or a lack of structure at home. And then second most was biology and genetics. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our first study in San Francisco and look at what we found about decision to seek help. So our question was, will the Latinx youth be under-enrolled in ADHD services compared to non-Latinx youth in San Francisco? And what we did find was when we asked all 159 families about other services they were receiving, there was a trend towards significance that Latinx youth were less likely to be receiving external services. So like parent training in the community, medication, anything like that, anything that doesn't happen in the school, they were a little bit less likely. However, when we looked at the percentage of Latinx students enrolled in CLS in our trial, it was pretty comparable to the proportion of Latinx youth in the district. And if we added our Spanish-speaking cohorts, we actually over-enrolled for Latinx youth compared to that demographic. So what this is showing us is if you have school-based services available in English and Spanish, you may be able to overcome some of those disparities in service decision to seek help. When we asked the families, like, what was it about this program that made you participate? How did you feel when you were, when your child was identified as needing this program, and how did you feel when you were referred? We got both positive and negative reactions. So one person said, when I found out the group was coming, I was delighted. And notice she says group, not treatment. I think that could be an important clue. And then someone was some of the families talked about the cultural context of the referral, and one mom said because we were Latinos and sometimes we are a little gossipy, they labeled him like he was a very bad boy, and he wasn't like that. So this is still showing some of that stigma and kind of lack of community support for families who are experiencing youth with ADHD. So, looking back to Mexico, we wanted to see if utilizing that video not only would help us do our needs assessment, but would it also help us recruit enough families for our treatment pilot. And sure enough, most of the families who viewed the video said that they would be very likely to seek help for that child. So it is showing that those behaviors are something that's concerning to the families. And when we asked what kind of help people would seek, most of the people said the school. So that fares well for my program since it's school-based. The mental health profession was next, followed by family and friends. Notice that fourth was a pediatrician or doctor. So not even in the top 3 of ideas for help for ADHD when we asked the Mexican families. And really, really importantly, we did reach our desired sample size for the ADHD treatment pilot in Mexico. And again, we didn't do a randomized controlled design where we did the outreach in one school and not the other, so I can't say for sure that the video helped us reach our sample size, but anecdotally it certainly seemed to help. All right, so now going on to the last step of the model, service utilization. So really this was a main question from our CLS study in the United States. Would the Latinx families attend, engage, and benefit from the families similarly to our non-Latinx families? And we found really, really promising results. So Latinx families were equally likely to attend, equally likely to engage. That engagement was rated by our clinician observers. Latinx families were equally satisfied at the end of the program. And probably most importantly, Latinx youth were equally likely to improve as non-Latinx youth. So even with our small sample size of 24, we saw statistically significant differences such that the Latinx children receiving CLS improved more than the Latinx children waiting to receive CLS on symptoms of ADHD, on symptoms of ODD, and on impairment. And when we asked the families after, what did you see improve? Interestingly, they more spontaneously responded with impairment, which matches our findings from the problem recognition studies. So one mom said, but now that I have them, talking about routines, I don't have to constantly say something like, do this and that. He now does it on his own. Right, so following your routines is not a symptom of ADHD, but it is one of our most relevant impairment kind of proxies. And really more meaningful to the family than if he's driven by a motor or fidgeting, right? Like, who cares if he's fidgeting, if he's getting his routine done? When we asked the Latinx parents, like, what did you like about this program? What did you not like about this program? We really heard that they appreciated the collaborative nature between the school and the home. They really liked the rapport with the staff. They said the program was easy, and they really liked how it focused on skills and not like problems that had to be fixed. So one mom said, I liked it so much to hear about the children who have the same problem as my child. And that really shows that the families liked not only hearing from the social worker, but hearing from the other parents. So as I alluded to before, after we did the CLS program in the United States and showed really positive results, my colleague Ava said, let's bring this down to Mexico and see if we can adapt it here. And we called the program CLS Fuerte. This was actually based on qualitative feedback from one of our families in the United States. We asked them, we said, what should we call this program? And one mom said, well, I think you should call it something about strong families because that's what it does. It makes our families strong. Interestingly, attention's not in there, hyperactivity's not in there, right? It's more the benefit that they're seeing at the end that is ringing true for what we should call it. So when we were going to adapt the program for Mexico, we did have some groundwork laid for us by other successful evidence-based treatments adapted for Latinx communities worldwide. And across these efforts, some common themes are collaboration between the person or the team who originally developed the treatment and the community which it's being adapted for. Also, one common theme is making iterative revisions. So making really small changes, seeing if they work before making huge changes, right? Little by little tweaking. And then also what's really important is having a theoretical model that guides your adaptations. This is really important, I think, for replicability, right? Because you can adapt a program for one setting, but in order for other people to be able to benefit and adapt it for their setting, you kind of want to lay a trail of breadcrumbs that's really easily followed for other people. So what is the model that I am going to propose can be used, that can be replicated, that's theory-driven for adapting a treatment for a new population? So Bernal and Colley's ecological validity model is arguably the first model for adapting a treatment for a new population. And it outlines 8 domains that are specifically relevant for Latinx families. And on the right, you can see some strategies. How do you actually address those domains? Oops, there's some timing I have set up. Okay. So, for example, obviously you have to translate it into the language of origin, or the language of the community that you're serving. And we'll go through some of these other domains and how we adapted our treatment based on some, but not all of these domains. And this model was used by the PMTO Adaptation for Mexico City, as well as the PCIT Adaptation for Puerto Rico. Another model that doesn't focus on domains, but rather focuses on stages, is called the Cultural Adaptation Process Model. And so this has kind of 3 stages of how do we go about adapting the treatment. And the Strengthening Families program in Spain and Central America used the stage model as well as the PMTO model. So you might have noticed that that PMTO model used both the ecological validity and the cultural adaptation process model, which is called a stacked approach. approach. And I liked it the best, so that's what I decided to copy for our design. So, to set the stage, first you have to choose what service you're going to adapt in the target population. So we knew we were adapting CLS for the Culiacan Public Schools, and luckily we had that partnership already developed. The next thing you do is make limited changes to see if and which future changes are needed. And this is really a new development. When cultural adaptation really started to take off about 15 or 20 years ago, people would take a treatment, completely adapt it based on what they thought, and then they'd give it, and they'd say, oh, look, it's working great. People would say, well, that's great, but is it working great because you adapted it, or is it working great because it was fine to begin with? And if you don't do those initial adaptation stages, you can't answer that question. So it's really important to be thoughtful about only making changes that are needed in your first pilot. So what we did, we obviously had to translate it into Spanish, and we had to translate it into Spanish that matched Culiacan, Sinaloa, which is a teeny bit different than San Francisco. So for example, one of our strategies is called attending. When we directly translated that, it translates to attention, which is super confusing, especially about a program improving attention, right? So we just changed it to special time. So this is an example of decentering, where you don't do a literal translation, but instead you really emphasize the meaning more so than the actual words. So along the concept domain, as I said, we also changed the name to Cls Fuerte to emphasize strength. And then the only other changes we made were minor changes to the methods. So because in Mexico we anticipated abuelas and other caregivers participating in place of parents, we changed all the wording to caregivers instead of parents. We also streamlined the evaluation procedure and measures, because although in the United States we're really used to filling in bubbles and answering questionnaires, it's really not that common in the area that we were in. Because of the Mexican calendar and their wonderful value of taking vacation and holidays better than we do here in America, we had to kind of adjust the structure of our groups. So instead of 10 60-minute groups, which we ran in the United States, we kind of truncated it down into 6 90-minute groups, emphasizing the strategies that the San Francisco Latinx families found the most beneficial. And then we took the other strategies and had them be like supplementary booster sessions. The school said 6 kids isn't enough. If we're going to do this, we want to reach more kids, so we extended our sample size to 8. And then we also did an augmented outreach recruitment strategy, which I already explained in the problem recognition and decision to seek help portions of this. Okay, so this is our exciting results boiled down into one slide. Although this can look really overwhelming, if you just do a quick wash across, what you'll see is we really found no differences in fidelity of the student group or the parent group or the classroom component. CLS in Mexico, CLS in Spanish in San Francisco, and the original CLS. Right? So what we see is that students, the social workers can deliver above 90% of that student group content. Students are attending above 90%. And when we're rating how well the social worker is delivering that content, they're getting really good ratings. So over 4 out of 5 on a Likert scale. Same story with the parent group. And then if we look at the classroom component, every child across all 3 groups had at least one meeting with the parent, the child, and the social worker, and the teacher. And if we look at how often those teachers are using the daily report card, they're using it more days than not, which actually turns out is good enough. And the parents are checking the daily report card most days. So that's showing that fidelity is the same wherever the program is delivered, but the most important aspect is probably, are the outcomes the same? Are the kids and the families getting better the same way? And indeed they are. So here we see that parents and teachers rate ADHD symptoms significantly lower after children have received the program versus the children who just were on the wait list. Even though the the CLS program was not designed for ODD, we're really finding across all of our studies that ODD symptoms do improve as well. And then impairment is also rated as much improved by both parents and teachers, and we're finding medium to large effects. So pretty compelling results here showing that if you deliver this program in the schools faithfully, the kids do really well. One really important aspect of community-engaged global work is disseminating the results to the community. So our CLS paper isn't out, or our CLS working paper isn't out yet, but every year we do conferences at the schools demonstrating our results to date. And we also do a lot of recognition for the schools and the social workers who learn and train in the program, because it's quite a lot of effort that they put in, and they do a fantastic job. So we really make an effort to acknowledge that every year. And then we also do a pretty good job of disseminating our results to the community through the media. So this program gained quite a lot of steam in Culiacan. The district wants it in every single school. There's now a wait list of schools. We didn't ask them to do that, but they've on their own developed a wait list of schools to do CLS for a day. So it's really been embraced by the community, which is lovely. So, in summary, CLS in Mexico with minor adaptations showed good fidelity, good attendance and engagement from those families, and significant improvements. So, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, right? We really didn't have to make a whole lot of changes to the program in order for it to do very well. All right, so if we go back to our overall recommendations, this is what I showed before going into the studies about theoretically those solutions in CLS that could combat barriers to help seeking for Latinx families. So our data is really showing that it's important, in addition, to emphasize impairment and potential improvement over symptomatology. So how do you do that? How do you emphasize impairment? Luckily, my dissertation was to develop a culturally sensitive impairment measure to go along with ADHD. And so this is the ADHD-FX. It's a 32-item scale. It's available on my personal ResearchGate account. You can just download it for free. It's also available in the appendix of the article in Journal of Attention Disorders. We've been using it in our clinics. Every clinic I've worked in since training uses it, and it's a really nice measure focused on those things that I said families care about. How is the kid doing in school? How is the kid getting along with other kids? How is your home environment? We also adapted the scale for Mexico. We call it the FX2. And how we adapted it was, instead of asking about impairment, we flipped it and asked about functioning. So instead of saying, like, how often is the child forgetting his homework, we say, how often is the child turning in his homework? And we find that just that shift is much more culturally syntonic with the way that Latinx families are viewing and conceptualizing their children's strengths. And we also included a parent-teacher and peer support subscale, and this is in hopes of, in the future, showing the mechanisms for why CLS actually works. So in theory, CLS works because the parents and teachers become more consistent, and so we want to actually show that in our measure, and spoiler alert, it's looking like that is working out, so that'll be a future paper, but we don't have the data already. Okay, so our work also shows that it's really helpful to align with traditional Latinx values like respeto and familismo. One way that our team has done this is just building rapport and trust with our research staff and the families. We call this compartir vivencias. So for example, my colleagues and I will often get to the groups a little bit early and just do some friendly chit chat with families that's on a more personal level than maybe your traditional lab family interaction. And we found that really helps the families feel at ease with us and feel like we're all a team rather than it being a hierarchical structure. And then as I mentioned in those first help-seeking behavior stages, it really seems helpful to do broader outreach, not just to the families that are needing ADHD care, but to the greater community in order to reduce stigma and misconceptions. And video seems like it might be a really promising way to do that. So our next plans, since we're on our second stage of initial adaptations, we are currently applying for funding for adaptation iterations. And although CLS works really well, CLS Forte works really well, it takes a lot of effort from the clinical research staff to be there, to help the families get recruited, to help fidelity monitor. And so our new study, which started here in San Francisco and we're hoping to bring to Mexico, is actually bringing that training for the school social workers out of the live universe and onto the web. So we've been doing a lot via Zoom, all the materials are up on the web page. We've done a lot with exemplifying the skills in family videos, kind of like I showed with the little boy with ADHD, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words, so a video is worth 1,000,000 words, right? And so hopefully in November, we're applying for an R21 through Fogarty to adapt the web-based program for Mexico. And so I just want to thank, there are a lot of people that helped bring this work together, both here in the United States and in Mexico. All right, and I did it. I left about 7 minutes for questions. So thank you for bearing with that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at this time.
Really impressive work and very hopeful results. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm Chan, I'm a school student. So my question is, it's really great that we can achieve this kind of result when we remove the barriers of this very stigmatizing diagnosis and how we, when we change the way we approach parents and the kids. But the reality is still, you know, reality has its own structure, and as these kids grow up, because ADHD, ADD, they can have other mental health comorbidities, and when they are seeking mental health support or treatment as an adult, if you don't give it the diagnosis, like how do they communicate that when they go to hospitals as part of their past mental health history? How do you bridge that as they grow older?
That's a really great question. We do a lot of psychoeducation in the groups, more for the parents, less for the kids, because they're in 1st to 5th grade, so they're have pretty low insight in terms of like diagnostic terminology. But we do give a lot of psychoeducation to the parents about how this program is, once they're already enrolled in the first session, how this program was designed for children with attention and impulse control challenges like ADHD, and then we talk about what the brain mechanisms are for that. You know, these children are motivated by more immediate, tangible rewards. These children's executive functioning, they need more help with planning and prioritizing. And so we try to give the education that they would need to move forward, being successful throughout the lifespan without using that terminology. Another reason, I don't think this is why we don't talk about ADHD as a diagnosis, but I do think it's helpful, is that some of our children, because we don't do a thorough diagnosis, some of our children may be exhibiting inattention and impulse control difficulties for a different reason than organic ADHD, like trauma, like, especially in our communities, a lot of these kids, it might not actually be ADHD, it might be something else. But what the behavioral treatment data shows us is that it actually doesn't matter why the child's having these attention and behavior challenges. The strategies about increasing structure and immediate reinforcement work regardless of why it's happening. And I would hope that as we're improving ADHD treatment in the schools, other treatment's improving as well. So in the United States, we're starting to really gain movement of the 3-tier system in schools, where you have supports for everybody, and then you have supports for a certain group of kids that need it, and then you have individual supports for kids who really need it. And so if there's a kid in the CLS program who goes on to develop anxiety, depression, hopefully the school system has a tiered intervention that could address that.
I would like to ask you, Lauren, a little bit about the type of schools in which you adapted this model in Culiacan. Do you think that you could say that the schools that you were using in Culiacan are similar to the public school district here in the United States?
I I would say that there are some differences. So we were in the public schools in Culiacan, and we asked the district to give us a mix of like a higher resource public schools and a lower resource public schools. And then when we did our randomization, we matched. So we did, one waitlist school, one treatment school from the high group, one from the low group. Some differences in the resources and the school makeup in Culiacan and San Francisco. Resources were much more scarce in Culiacan. So one of our groups, we actually couldn't do it in a classroom. We had to do it outside at recess, and it was extremely difficult. You can imagine kids with attention problems, not having a physical space to contain them was really hard. Also, in the United States, I kept saying the word school social worker. In Mexico, they're actually not school social worker, they're support teachers. But interestingly, we haven't found differences in fidelity based on if they have like a licensed, like they're a licensed clinical social worker or they're a support teacher. With our future grant for the remote training, we're hoping that we can go to even more diverse schools and also go to districts that are quite dangerous that we weren't able to go in the live version because we didn't feel comfortable sending our staff there after dark. We would be able to do that with the remote version. So hopefully we'll be able to see if this program works in all different kinds of schools, not just the kind of schools that we've been able to
with
with thus far.
children, because I was thinking in terms of Culiacan, I was thinking about the different places in which these children are sometimes more exposed to trauma than in another schools.
Yes.
Depending on the neighborhood.
Yes, and that's why when we did that, the split, we made sure to counterbalance because of that. And indeed, we had youth in our study who were actively experiencing family members being brutally murdered from cartel violence. So it was in the thread of this program, even though it's not in there, it was all around us at all times.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.